The Capitol was buzzing with tension even before the session began. With reporters anticipating another polarizing debate between Republicans and Democrats, the atmosphere was thick with political friction as the topic of discussion centered around the most recent racial justice bill proposed by the House, Jasmine Crockett. The rising Democratic Congresswoman from Texas came prepared with statistics, stories from her constituents, and a fierce determination to make her voice heard. Senator JD Vance, on the other hand, had already made headlines with his controversial Searchable statements in the past, and many wondered how far he would go this time. As the two sat across from one another, there was a sense of unease, almost like the room itself was holding its breath. Crockett began her remarks by detailing systemic inequalities in housing, education, and healthcare that disproportionately affect communities of color. She spoke with fire and empathy, pointing out policies she believed were deliberately designed to marginalize vulnerable populations. Vance, seemingly unimpressed, shuffled his papers and smirked, preparing to respond. What followed next would sparked a national outrage that no one in the chamber was ready for. Vance leaned forward, tapping his microphone before launching into a rebuttal filled with dismissive rhetoric. He referred to the bill as another leftist overreach, arguing that the data Crockett cited was cherry-picked and lacking context. Crockett sat silently, watching him, arms folded but eyes sharp. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Vance muttered, under his breath loud enough for nearby microphones to catch it, "Maybe she should go back to the zoo where she came from." The words echoed like a slap across the room, and a stunned silence followed. Several senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One aide dropped their pen. Crockett's face didn't flinch. She didn't storm out, nor did she raise her voice. Instead, she sat still, expression unreadable, while murmurs and gasps filled the chamber. The moderator hesitated, unsure whether to call for order or continue. Vance appeared unaware, or perhaps unconcerned about the gravity of what he had just said. But the moment would not pass quietly. Social media had already caught wind of. The slur and footage was circulating by the minute. The Capitol Press Corps had their headline. What came next would elevate the moment from scandal to historical reckoning. When the murmurs finally quieted, Jasmine Crockett leaned toward her microphone, her voice steady but laced with steel. "Senator Vance," she began, pausing to ensure every ear in the room was on her. "It's always telling when a man who claims to champion traditional values can't seem to remember the value of basic human decency." The chamber froze as she continued. "See, you thought you were being clever, condescending, maybe even provocative? But what you did wasn't just offensive to MIT, was a betrayal of every American who believes in dignity and equality." Her tone sharpened as she added, "And if being passionate about justice makes me a wild animal in your eyes, then perhaps it's time we redefine what civilization really looks like." Applause began slowly, hesitantly, from a few members in the back. Then it swelled. Crockett didn't stop. "But since you brought up the zoo, let's talk about cages," she said, her voice rising. "Cages at the border, cages in our prison system, cages of economic oppression. Who put us in those cages, Senator? It's really the zookeeper in this country." The room was electric. Even Vance, whose smirk had faded, looked rattled for the first time. Crockett's words reverberated not only through the chamber, but far beyond. Within minutes, news outlets had picked up the clip, and it was trending on every social media platform. Hashtags like Zoogate and Crockett Clapback began, dominating timelines. Celebrities, athletes, and political figures alike weighed in, many calling for JD Vance to issue an apology and face consequences for what was widely condemned as a racist, dehumanizing remark. Meanwhile, Crockett was being praised for her composure, eloquence, and razor-sharp wit. In interviews following the session, she refused to play the victim. "I wasn't surprised," she said during an MSNBC interview later that evening. "What he said was cruel, but it wasn't new. That's the kind of racism that's been embedded in politics forever. It's just less coded now." Activists organized. Demonstrations outside the Capitol, with posters quoting Crockett's now iconic line about cages and zookeepers. It was no longer just about a verbal insult. It had become a national conversation about representation, dignity, and the cost of silence in the face of hate. As pressure mounted, JD Vance initially avoided public appearances, reportedly consulting with aides and legal teams on how to manage the backlash. A tepid written statement was released by his office, calling the incident a misunderstanding and claiming that his words had been taken out of context. The public wasn't buying it. Political commentators tore into the non-apology, pointing out the clarity and audibility of his slur. Even some of Vance's Republican colleagues began to distance themselves. One senator anonymously told CNN, "This isn't defensible. It's not about party lines anymore." Calls for censure echoed through the halls of Congress. Meanwhile, Crockett continued her advocacy work, using the spotlight to bring attention to the very issues she had been trying to highlight during the session. She spoke at universities, appeared on talk shows, and was invited to panels on racial equity. What was meant as a dehumanizing remark had become a catalyst for empowerment. "They tried to reduce me to an animal," she told Trevor Noah, "and instead, they exposed just how primitive their thinking really is." Public sentiment was overwhelming. Petitions calling for Vance's resignation gathered millions of signatures. Civil rights leaders, including figures from the NAACP and ACLU, released joint statements condemning his actions. Even some conservative media figures expressed discomfort, noting that Vance's words had overshadowed any legitimate critique he may have had about the bill itself. For many Americans, the moment crystallized how language can be used to dehumanize, and how silence or ambiguity in response only fuels harm. Schools began using the exchange in media literacy and civics classes. Jasmine Crockett had become more than a politician. She was a symbol of unshakable grace under fire. In response, she launched a new initiative focused on uplifting young black voices in politics, offering scholarships and mentorship to students who wanted to follow in her footsteps. "I want to make sure that no one ever feels like they have to shrink themselves to survive," she said during the program's launch. It was a full-circle moment, turning pain into purpose, slurs into speeches, and cruelty into clarity. While the nation rallied around Crockett, JD Vance's standing within his own party became increasingly precarious. Rumors circulated that major donors were reconsidering their support, and his future in politics was suddenly in jeopardy. He attempted a televised apology days later, seated before a neutral background, reciting prepared remarks in a flat tone. "I deeply regret any offense caused by my words," he stated, avoiding eye contact with the camera. The response was swift and merciless. Commentators called it hollow. Activists labeled it a PR stunt. Crockett, for her part, didn't directly respond to the apology, instead retweeting a video of Maya Angelou reading "Still I Rise." Her silence was louder than words. Even her political opponents acknowledged the strength of her position. "You don't have to agree with her politics to respect how she handled herself," one analyst on Fox News admitted. The contrast between the two leaders couldn't have been starker, one reduced by his own ignorance, the other elevated by her integrity. The legacy of the incident took on a life of its own. Documentaries began chronicling the fallout, and a well-known filmmaker even approached Crockett about optioning her story. College debate teams reenacted her comeback during national tournaments. Artists painted murals of her with imagery drawn from her powerful metaphor cages, keys, and lions walking free. A best-selling author published a book titled The Zookeeper's Mistake, exploring the symbolism behind the confrontation and how it resonated with America's racial and political history. In interviews, Crockett remained grounded. "I'm not the first to face this kind of disrespect," she said. "But if I can help ensure I'm one of the last, then I've done my job." Her office reported a surge in internship applications, particularly from young women of color. Meanwhile, JD Vance's political influence waned. He lost several committee appointments and found himself marginalized within key Senate discussions. What began as an insult had become a cultural turning point, redefining power, poise, and the cost of prejudice. In the months that followed, legislation connected to the original racial justice bill saw renewed interest. With heightened public awareness and bipartisan pressure, several key provisions passed the House with significant support. Crockett remained instrumental in shepherding these reforms, often invoking the firestorm not as a grievance, but as a galvanizing moment. "Let's not waste our outrage," she declared during a speech on the House floor. "Let's turn it into action." Her leadership won her the admiration of colleagues and the affection of millions across the country. Awards, honors, and recognition flowed in, but she continued to insist that her work was far from over. Meanwhile, Vance's re-election prospects dwindled. Polling in his district showed a sharp decline in approval ratings, and challengers from within his own party